Well, on a related note, I'm curious how Europe is sort of handling the situation of being very dependent on Russia for a variety of things. How they are dealing with the fact that they have to, deal with this in this kind of wartime situation, because if something ever breaks out with China and Taiwan, or there's some other kind of situation, the world is very dependent on China. The U.S. gets most of its medicine from China. So we need to see the lessons of how is Europe becoming less dependent on Russia in the midst of this, because we might have to do that with China.
So they've kind of come up with expedited plans to replace Russian energy. I can speak mostly to what Germany has been doing, and we've sent our Minister of Economy to Qatar to cut a deal with the Qatari government, right? So they're making all kinds of they're basically looking for solutions all over the place, and some of those solutions are better than others. However, I think most of them can probably be justified in the short term. It's if you need to make yourself independent of Russian oil and gas as fast as possible, then of course you're going to be doing things that you weren't willing to do before. So they're expediting that. They're not willing to cut it off, to say we will stop importing oil and gas. They have, I think, very recently agreed at the EU level to stop importing Russian coal in mid-August, which coal is fairly insignificant compared to oil and gas. But they've agreed on that at the EU level. In the German case, they're trying to get away from that dependence as fast as possible, but of course that's really not fast enough for Ukraine. I think it's simply taking too long. That's one thing, and that's the other thing that I worry about when it comes to dependencies on China, which of course, you have big companies that are dependent on China as a market or as a production site, but you also do have those dependencies such as in medicine. And I feel like without the incentive of a concrete war, without being in this crisis situation, reducing those dependencies is probably going to move too slowly. Right now, we see that with Russia, we have this very concrete crisis where continuing as before has very high costs for Ukraine. And they're already operating in crisis mode, but it's still slow. So without having this concrete crisis in the Chinese case, I'm worried that we're going to move even more slowly, and that some people might argue, but our economies are already taking such a big hit. Do we really need to cut China out in this and that area now at the same time? Won't thus make us less prosperous? That's usually the argument you're going to get in Germany. They know they need to reduce their strategic dependencies on China, in strategic sectors where China could use that sector to actively harm us in a conflict. They have written that in the German case into their coalition treaty. We currently have a coalition government in Germany between three parties, and in their coalition agreement, it basically says we have to reduce strategic dependencies on China. I'm really more worried that it's going to be much too slow and much too reluctant, and that a lot of the mistakes that were made with Russia are going to be repeated with China, despite the current environment.
I mean, I wonder, when you said earlier in the podcast about Germany's dependencies on China and how sometimes the perception of the dependency is the dependency is greater than the actual dependency. I wonder if that's also kind of slowing down the process, because then you're more likely to have people argue things that we're, it's just too big. We need them. We can't, and then you have the pressure from the companies that are making a lot of money in China that don't want to have to pull out or reallocate or whatever. That the perception of the dependency becomes a bigger stumbling block in some ways than the actual dependency.
Well, yeah, especially when it's BMW having this loud voice and lobbying specifically, right? I mean, you have a distortion of reality when you have a small number of large, powerful companies that are sort of pushing a particular worldview.
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of the problem that those that have a real interest in not making this happen can use this lack of concrete knowledge to argue that the dependency is much bigger and we're going to hurt ourselves much more, which is why it is so important to disaggregate this, to look at this in detail, to come up with actual studies like where do these dependencies exist, where are they one-sided, where are they mutual, and where can we, even in times of, not an imminent, not having a crisis compared to that which we currently have with the war in Ukraine, where can we start reducing that in meaningful ways as fast as possible? That's really the work that we need, to look at it in detail and then get going on it, and not repeat the same mistake. But it's going to be, I think, a bit of an uphill battle.
I mean, fortunately, there's lots of other authoritarian countries Europe can get oil from, and lots of great, authoritarian and developing countries. They can get manufacturing, like Vietnam. That's a beautiful communist country you can get your stuff made in.
Well, but we'll. I mean, I know what you're saying, but I just, I mean, there's not going to be a perfect solution, right? Is it better for it to go to Vietnam
than China? It is. I would say that the phrase would be it's less bad. Yeah. Vietnam, the communist government of Vietnam is a threat to its own people. But geopolitically, Vietnam is not a threat to the United States or Europe.
It's essentially a log.
What?
Well, compared to China, it's better than bad. It's good. It's the log way of looking at geopolitics.
Okay.
It rolls downstairs, rolls over in pairs, rolls over your neighbor's dog. Do you feel like that applies as well? Or is that just taking it too far, Chris?
Yeah, I think you did take it too far, Matt.
I never really thought that we'd have a Ren and Stimpy reference.
You clearly have never watched this show, then.
This show or Ren and Stimpy? Because I actually never watched Ren and Stimpy.
What? All right, hold on. Pause the podcast. We have to
show Shelley several
with
seasons.
Strict Chinese parents. I don't know why this is like really very surprising.
All right, we have an important question for you, Mareike.
Yeah.
Have you watched Ren and Stimpy?
No.
Oh my goodness!
I mean, I don't know that really was broadcast in Germany.
Yeah, so you've just been confused for the last few minutes. Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna ask. Right. I was gonna ask.
It's a reference to a '90s children's animated show.
It should not have been for children.
Yeah. But I wasn't allowed to watch TV as a kid, so even if it had been shown over here, I wouldn't have seen it. So.
All right. Well, so the nice thing about being derailed in a conversation is you can get back on the rails.
Yes.
What were we talking about? Oh, Vietnam.
About how Europe can get stuff
alternatives
made in other places that are marginally less bad than China.
I mean, it's a start. Yeah. Like, I think the problem is when, like, look at what happened with COVID and, China essentially prohibited exports of masks, right, in the early days of the pandemic. And then when we had that guy on our podcast from Prestige Ameritech, like one of the only companies that makes surgical masks in the US, and he was talking about now Chinese masks are flooding the market. Like over the last year or so, after they stopped restricting exports, they instead essentially sought to undercut any other companies
U.S. taxpayer dollars went towards buying Chinese masks.
Yeah,
I think California spent $3 billion on Chinese masks.
We went right back to doing what we were doing before, but more so. And then look at your COVID test, right? Like if you have an at-home COVID test, like the chances are it's made in China.
We're China addicts.
But I think that's part of the problem is like a lot of the solutions where we bring production home to our own countries is just not economical in non-crisis times. Like it's great when you have it in times of crisis when China restricts its exports, but then once China starts not doing that anymore, then the products here can't compete. I think that's the problem. So how can you secure your supply in the long run, still have products that can compete, not deal with that. And I think, Vietnam, I think a lot of companies have actually done that, and they're starting to do that. And it's apparently, and again, it's not my area of expertise, but apparently it's getting to a point where it's becoming more difficult in terms of capacity in Vietnam, and where companies are finding that is like they're forced to find an alternative, and many, I think, are looking hard for an alternative because this whole COVID lockdown supply chain issues really freaks everybody out. But it's also that China has been in that spot for so long. It's like simply very specialized in providing these manufacturing services, and that is possible, but not super easy to build that up quickly elsewhere. So that I think is some of the problems that some of the companies are facing. But I also think that this is an issue they're going to face at some point. So they need to try harder to make themselves less dependent.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the UK that just recently allowed a Chinese company to take over their largest microchip manufacturer. They
said it wasn't a security concern because China already had that technology.
Or
it's not the technology, it's their control of the manufacturing.
I mean, it seems like, you mentioned like, unless there's a crisis, we're not going to do anything. So it seems like we're just digging a hole for ourselves, and China could bury us. Well,
the good news, Chris, is that the UK doesn't count because it's not in Europe anymore.
Yeah.
The one advantage that we now have in Europe is we can point towards the Russian example and, say that you are arguing that we can't afford to not buy Russian gas and oil. And you kept arguing for it. And now you're crying about how, if Putin shuts it off, you're going to see German industry die. And, let's not repeat that scenario in the future just with another country. So we now have good arguments. It's more a question of is the voice of those arguing for that going to be strong enough to argue against fairly big, reasonably politically influential companies in Germany. And that is, it's not exactly a fair fight.